Chapter 45 The Festival of Inspiration. Summer storm clouds hung heavy overhead as Argenport prepared for the grand festival. Sweltering heat and nervous excitement drove people outdoors, flooding the streets with anxious thronging crowds. "Caleb is heir at last," some crowed. "With Eilyn gone and the clans destroyed, we may finally be safe. Sol shines on Caiaphas and his wisdom," others agreed. Some citizens moved about quietly, their gaze downcast. They had seen what came for those who voiced their dissent. Throughout the city, the Crown Watch continued its hunt for Vara, and as more ranks spread out and searched, they brought more news from the spire. The week-long festival of inspiration would begin with the recognition of Caleb as heir to the throne, and at its midpoint, the traitor queen would be executed. And as the revels reached their full height, Caleb would ascend the spire and be crowned king, to claim his seat beside his father and usher in a new age of triumph and unity for Argenport. At this proclamation, the crowds began to murmur, and speculation ran through the city like lightning. A festival of inspiration? That old tradition? Argenport hasn't seen anything like that in living memory. And Caleb is to be crowned? Father and son ruling side by side? What is Caiaphas planning? Will his gaze finally shift beyond Argenport's walls? From her cell, in the depths of the Crown Watch dungeons, Eilyn smiled grimly. "Caleb, you fool. Better you than Vara," she said, staring into the gloom. "You were made for it, after all." In one of Argenport's busiest marketplaces, the flagstones rang with steel boots. "Everyone out! The square's needed for the festival!" a Crown Watch soldier bellowed, his mailed fist resting near the hilt of a notched broadsword. Heads turned, and some of the crowd hurried away. "Move!" "But my stall!" one of the merchants cried, gesturing to the heavy suits of armor hanging from the walls of his booth. "My wares!" "Take what you can carry, and leave the rest," the man barked. Behind him, a pair of minotaurs stepped forward holding coiled whips and heavy hammers. "The Auric Bank will assist with any damages," he added with a sneer. As the merchant was led away, the captain turned to the Longhorn guards and added, "Get everyone moving. Clean out the rubbish. The spire needs this place clear by nightfall." The minotaurs grunted and moved in. The next morning the plaza stood vacant, the marble shining like polished bone. Any debris had been cleared away, and the vagrants and other drifters who often slept there had been encouraged to seek shelter elsewhere. They were replaced by a squad of tinkers who bustled about constructing new booths, stages, and a large, ornate central platform. They were industrious, and did not notice a pair of small shapes crouched in a darkened alleyway at the far corner of the plaza. "Is that it?" Vara whispered, nodding at the large wooden dais. Next to her, Coslo grimaced. "That's it. That's what I saw in my vision. That's where they're going to execute Eilyn." Something dangerous flashed in Vara's eyes. "Not if I have anything to say about it." She stepped back, farther into the shadows, as a tinker passed near their hiding spot. "Think this'll work?" Coslo looked down at his rust-stained hands. "Should do. Everything we scrounge from the junkyard will make one hell of a distraction. Good thing Wyatt owed you a favor." Coslo traded a grin with Vara. The old man was cantankerous, but had a soft spot for the urchin, who had sold odds and ends to Wyatt for years. "We'll have to find the right moment," Vara added, turning back to the festival preparation. As the tinkers finished up their work, entertainers and artisans began to arrive. Fortune-tellers, fire-jugglers, oni-smiths, and more all entered the square. the sun catching their brightly colored cloaks and gleaming armor. Coslo and Vara watched as they stood up shop, practicing their arts and preparing their stalls under the careful eye of the Crown Watch guards. As the performers gathered, so too did the staring, gawking crowds outside the plaza. The guards held them at bay, but the press of bodies continued to grow. "Why is everyone watching?" Vara asked, thankful for the cool shade of the alley as the noonday sun burned overhead. Coslo snorted. "You had performers and tutors up in the spire, yeah? Well, us down here in the streets don't. Nothing to see except the occasional tavern brawl." He shrugged. "Little to celebrate when you're trying to survive, so people are curious." Vara frowned, thoughtful. After a quiet moment, she opened her mouth to speak, but froze as the low buzz of conversation was broken by loud, brash laughter. Coslo and Vara watched as Caleb pushed his way through the crowd, shoving a small yeti aside as he ascended the steps of the central stage. "Damn impressive. This'll make a fine centerpiece for the festivities," he said, turning to face the crowd with his arms outstretched. "Why is Caiaphas throwing a festival of inspiration?" someone called out from the crowd. Caleb flashed a quick grin. "It's not every day Argenport crowns a new king." "But what about Vara?" a different voice asked. "She's still out there, isn't she?" Caleb's smile sharpened, and the captain of the guard stepped forward, eyes scanning the faces below. But the prince held up a hand, halting the man, and drew the heavy shotgun from its holster on his hip. "She's welcome to challenge whenever she likes," he said, voice ringing over the square. "But I wouldn't bet on it. She ain't much of a fighter. Neither were her mother's clans, from what I hear." "That bastard!" Vara snarled as the crowd laughed. As she rose, the shadows around her began to contort and darken until Coslo put a hand on her shoulder. "Not yet," he whispered. "We get caught now, it's all over." Vara scowled, but jerked her head in frustrated acknowledgement, her eyes never leaving Caleb's grin or the steely hunter's eyes above it. The ancient stones of the throne room were still cool, and the room itself lit by only a few flickering torches. Their meager light reflected off Caiaphas's bronze armor as he leaned forward from his seat on the eternal throne. "And you're sure it will work?" His sallow skin tightened in a frown, but his eyes glittered with a cold cunning. "Yes, brother," Talia replied, frustration tinging the Archmagister's voice. She stood at the foot of the throne. The edges of her robes shifted and danced, as if caught in a desert breeze only she could feel. "We have been through this. The boy is your blood, and the throne will recognize it. His strength will be your strength, and more." Caiaphas nodded, his silver brows furrowing. "What has you worried, O king?" his sister asked mockingly, leaning forward on her staff. Scowling, Caiaphas said, "My daughter has yet to be detained." "Her?" Talia laughed, a bright, sharp sound, like breaking glass. "Vara is a child. She is nothing. Besides," the Archmagister added with a smile, "you have her mother. You know exactly what Vara will be during the festival." "Loyalty was always one of Eilyn's failings," Caiaphas mused. "Vara too, it seems. Very well. I will take some additional precautions. And Talia?" "Yes, brother." "Don't you dare question me like that again," Caiaphas snarled. As he did, the lines and grooves of the eternal throne flared with a furious, hissing light. Talia flinched and looked away. "Of course." Dusk was creeping into the main festival plaza, When the nightmares arrived, a cohort of Valkyries descended on leathery wings, falling into position behind a hulking, armored figure. "Is everything in place?" Roland asked, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute command. "Yes, Commander," one of his Valkyries hissed. "Akaria is meeting with the senior Crown Watch to impress upon them the importance of the occasion." "Very well," Roland said, slowly scanning the great square. As he did, his left arm clenched, the joints creaking and popping as it formed a fist. The limb was massive, its skin mottled and gray, though the muscles beneath bulged as Roland paced. The Iron Tyrant's gaze briefly landed on the mouth of the darkened alleyway, but its occupants were long gone, escaped back into the slums to prepare. "Into the air and sweep the area," he ordered, raising the stinking arm in a heavy gesture. "Curfew is mandatory. Cut down any who argues." Before the nearest Valkyrie could speak, Roland seized her by the collar and drew her in close. "The festival and coronation are important to my nephew. Caiaphas will usher in a new age for Argenport, and nothing disrupts his plans. Is that understood?" The Valkyrie choked out an affirmative and took to the sky, wings flapping unsteadily, the rush of air stirring the heavy cloak and hood Roland wore, and a sliver of argent moonlight caught the pale scars on his face and the shards of armor embedded in his pulsing arm. "Nothing will stand in his way," Roland swore. "Nothing